Is that correct?
That was the beginning of what the jury heard this afternoon in the Adrian Loya case out of Barnstable, Massachusetts. That's the case of a Coast Guard member accused of killing another Coast Guard member, injuring that Coast Guard member wife, and then injuring a responding police officer. So, Caroline, did anything really jump out at you in that, or was just all of it equally shocking?
Well, what I find interesting is I think you can really tell by the interrogator's voice just how shocked they are that this suspect is sitting in the interrogation room with them and completely laying everything out on the table for them in a way so devoid of emotion or really in any type of way trying to defend themselves. This is not your average interrogation, right? These officers are used to, having to use sort of manipulative tactics to draw out the truth. Well, here you can tell, I mean, they said, they asked this guy, well, what, you intended to take her out. What did you mean by that? And he said, murder her. I mean, and they
it just
kind
comes
of
right, it spills right out.
And you kind of just, then there's a beat, and then, because they don't know how to respond to that, because it's like,
they were expecting him to say, oh, I thought I was going to go visit the cat.
And then they were planning on, having this long drawn out, oh, were you really, that's what they do. So you just rarely get an interview of this nature where the defendant is just laying it all out for you.
Well, it reminds me of the legal definition of a confession, okay, because we get into this in so many other cases. Was the confession voluntary?
Right.
Was it coerced? And, legally, a confession is literally supposed to be someone spilling the beans.
Right.
Not dancing around the facts, not really getting it pried out of them, not the police using tricks psychologically to try to eventually pry one or two facts out of somebody who doesn't want to give them up. I mean, the Supreme Court has described the standard in that someone is giving themselves up by their own free will and kind of spilling the beans. Well, this seems like that kind of an interrogation. He's just spilling the beans. They're asking him one or two questions just to make sure they get details, but he's just telling the narrative start to finish. And they backed him up at one point and said, well, let's go over it a second time to make sure that we've got all of the dates and the facts correct. And then he goes through it all the way from start to finish again.
Right. I mean, typically a confession is not necessarily coerced, but it's drawn out by playing on the defendant's guilty conscience. So usually, the feelings of guilt so overwhelm the person being interrogated that they just can't handle it anymore and they confess. Now that's sort of a sane or rational person. Here, you obviously don't get any impression that there is any sense of remorse, of guilt, of perhaps an understanding. If I were the defense, I would say perhaps even an understanding of what he did was wrong. Look, if he's going into that interrogation room saying, so I wanted to take her out, yes, I wanted to murder her, and these are the steps that I did to bring about this result, that in a very strange way could in fact be evidence that he could not appreciate the fact that what he was doing was wrong. Now, not that he doesn't appreciate the fact that the things that he did were going to elicit a response from police. Certainly he knew that. In fact, he was intending upon that. In fact, you and I were talking off camera. We think, he may have been in shock, I think you said, because he wasn't expecting to be alive.
I wanted to kind of get into this with a tip towards what's happened in the previous days of this case. I think the defense attorney is really sharp. I think he's doing the best he can with a horrible hand of cards, okay? But one question that he has asked repeatedly of almost every single witness who could answer this question is, how was my client's demeanor? And the answer that he keeps getting back is calm and quiet. Eerily calm or shockingly calm or surprisingly calm, I think was one of the answers. But I was sitting there saying to myself the other day, why is this question being asked over and over and over again? And I'm assuming that the reason that the defense is asking it is to try to say, well, only someone who's nuts would be calm after having committed such an act.
Right.
That's my guess. That said, I think that there's another explanation that the prosecution can key into here. One is, well, there's two actually. The first is that he admitted that he'd been planning the thing for at a minimum a year and a half, maybe 2 years. He said he started planning it in 2013. It was very early 2015 when the act was actually committed. So there's, 2 years worth of planning there. Well, if he's been going over this in his head, day in and day out for that length of time, of course he wasn't going to be surprised. He had it all planned out. He had made the implements. He had made the fake bombs. He had collected all the ammunition. So to say that he should have somehow been shocked or in some other state of mind, I think just doesn't make any sense. So that's one thing. The second thing is, well, I think he might have been in shock that he was still alive.
Right.
Because he said he thought he was going to get killed by the police.
He did. In fact, he said, I think he said something to the effect of, I saw this as sort of, once he decided that he was going to do this, he saw it as a job that needed to get done before he closed up shop, meaning before he ended his own life. I mean, again, it's a very sort of clinical way to go about these statements, very devoid of any emotion, but it could point to perhaps him not fully appreciating sort of, the difference between right and wrong. I mean, he just decided to do something. Look, he could be
or he just resigned himself to the fact that he probably was going to die.
It sounds like he wanted to die. I mean, it sounds like I think he stated that he started engaging in fire with the police for the intended purpose of, it's not that uncommon, murder by police, suicide by police. So I think that, look, something went wrong. He was actually surprised at how sort of restrained the police were in their response to this sort of horrifically violent crime. But I agree. I think he could have been in that interrogation room kind of just thinking, wow, this did not go according to plan. I should not necessarily be here now. That wasn't how I had planned it in my mind. And now what's left for me to do? But I mean, he has to really admit to what he's done.
Yeah, I really think that he's in shock that he's still alive, or he's surprised that he's still alive, and that might account for some of the calmness. But it also might force this jury to really key in on how this guy was taken into custody, because as I understand the scenario, he wound up shooting the cop because the defendant was running through some wooded area. I don't know if that means like a property boundary, or if there were just some trees, or there was some bushes or brush. I don't know what that actually meant, but apparently the defendant was running through what the officers described as a wooded area. Presumably the jury saw it this morning, so they understand it.
Right.
When they were on the jury view, they probably saw it. So he's going through this wooded area. An officer is on alert that there's a shooter in the area. Okay, he hears this going on, and he says he starts to take cover. I don't know if it was a dumpster or a car, or he was trying to move from one to the other or something like that. But in the process of going to see what was up and assuming that it might be somebody, he gets shot. That's where he gets shot in the back.
Right.
The officer gets shot in the back. Now, that doesn't necessarily fit the MO of someone who's thinking about committing suicide by cop.
Sure.
Usually you think of them coming out with like guns blazing. They specifically point a weapon at an officer to elicit that kind of a response back from an officer. So that scenario that we're hearing from the police isn't quite the scenario we usually hear out of someone who's thinking of committing suicide by cop.
Yeah.
So that piece
but
of
it's
this doesn't
dark
make
out.
a
It was
lot
dark
of
out.
sense. It's dark. It's what,
Right.
5-10 degrees out.
Right.
It's February.
Right.
It's cold. There's snow on the ground. So I don't know. I mean, those pieces don't necessarily make sense to me yet.
Right.
And then when they eventually took him into custody, my understanding is, he put his hands up. And so then he says in this interrogation, well, I'm thinking, I'm surprised that the police showed so much restraint. And it's like, well, you didn't really do anything to, quote unquote, force them
Right.
to shoot you.
Right.
Of course they're going to show restraint. They don't shoot unless their lives are in danger.
Right.
If you shoot one of them in the back, one of them's not going to have a chance to shoot you first, because the guy who was struck, my understanding of the testimony is, didn't even see where it was coming from first. Okay, and then when you're confronted by force, you don't try to shoot back. Well, of course, they're just going to take you into custody and charge you and try you.
Right.
That's the way it works.
Right.
So I don't know, like those parts of this don't make a ton of sense to me yet. Do you think it's necessary that they be cleared up, or is this?
I don't, again, it's not going to come down to exactly what transpired when in terms of over the course of that night, because nobody is questioning whether or not he is the perpetrator of the crime. The question is just going simply to be, and this is going to be sort of a overarching decision in the jury's mind, whether during that evening he could appreciate really the ramifications of his actions. So it almost doesn't matter, again, what exactly happened in that scuffle, whether or not it was actually his true intention to commit suicide by cop, or whether or not he wanted to perpetrate the crime and get away with it. I mean, it's hard to imagine that his plan was to try to get away with this crime unnoticed. He wrote that manifesto. He laid the groundwork. He wrote the letter to his victim. So he seems pretty okay with the fact that he's going to be prosecuted for this crime. The question for me is why is he going to trial now? Why? I mean, look, obviously any defense attorney, it's their duty to vigorously pursue the rights of your client, and you don't necessarily have any say in, I mean, you have some say in terms of how strategically to pursue something, but not necessarily on the choice of whether or not to pursue a specific line of defense. So this has to be coming from the defendant. Now, it's also an interesting question, when you raise the defense of insanity, who then is running the defense here? Is it the defendant that said to his lawyer, I believe that I am insane? And is someone that's insane even, do they even have the ability to appreciate that fact? So it's really a unique situation that we have here, and I'm very interested to see, to understand the behind the scenes of what's going on between the defense attorney and the client.
Well, that's something that we won't ever really get to see, but we always wonder.
Yes.
We always do wonder. That's a privileged communication. We wonder, but of course we don't really ask too much because we respect that we won't be able to find out.
Right.
But
what I wouldn't give to be sort of a fly on the wall, I think that would be incredibly interesting.
Well, Caroline, you're a defense attorney. Why don't you tell me everything?
I've never done an insanity defense, so that's what I'm saying. I'm saying specifically for the insanity defense because, as a defense attorney, you work hand in hand with your client, and if you have a client that is mentally incapable of sort of rational thought and rational thinking, how does that then, as the defense attorney, how ethically then do you carry on with your duties as a defense attorney? I think that's kind of an interesting question.
Yeah, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. I mean, it's an extraordinary interrogation. I would really love to see the actual video of it because we're not able to see the body language.
Right.
Is the defendant sitting sort of military posture the way that he initially addressed the judge when this case started 2 days ago? Or is he leaning back like this, just nonchalantly spewing all of this?
It sounds
part of me just makes me wonder what the body language is.
Right. I mean, I'm going to guess that it's in keeping with his general demeanor throughout the course of this trial thus far, which is very upright, militaristic. I mean, this guy seems like he walks, talks, breathes, speaks military style. So I would be surprised if, I don't think he sort of relaxes at all, really.
Yeah, I really wonder. I mean, we're going to continue analyzing the Loya case here in just a couple of minutes, but I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about